Chapter 1. An Unexpected Roommate. Caleb had always been something of a space enthusiast, eagerly following humanity's first steps into interstellar diplomacy. Since Earth had joined the Galactic Alliance, a union of advanced civilizations, the very fabric of daily life on the planet had begun to change. People spoke of trading with alien species, attending galactic summits, and even opening their homes to alien exchange students. The Intergalactic Exchange Program was one such initiative, aimed at fostering better understanding between species. Caleb, seeing it as an opportunity to learn more about the universe, applied on a whim, not expecting much to come of it. Months later, when he received the approval letter stating that an alien would be staying with him, it still felt surreal. He cleaned his apartment meticulously, hiding away anything that might seem strange or offensive to an extraterrestrial visitor. He even went out of his way to stock his fridge with diverse foods, wondering if his new roommate would eat anything at all. But nothing could have prepared him for the reality of having Niara, a Zevian girl, standing on his doorstep. Niara was striking, with her tall and slender frame towering a good foot over Caleb. Her skin shimmered with a pale azure glow, like the surface of a tropical ocean under moonlight. Her lavender eyes were large and slightly almond-shaped, shining with an alien intensity that made Caleb feel as if she was studying him as much as he was observing her. Her silvery hair, flowing down to her waist, seemed almost alive, catching the light in a way that gave it an ethereal quality. In her hands, she carried a metallic suitcase covered in strange glyphs that Caleb couldn't hope to read. "Greetings," she said in a voice that had a musical cadence, yet was cool and detached. "I am Niara of Zevia. I believe you are Caleb James, my host?" Caleb swallowed, forcing himself to smile. "Yeah, that's me. Welcome to Earth. Come in." Niara stepped inside with a grace that seemed almost inhuman, her movements fluid and precise. She glanced around the apartment with mild curiosity, her gaze pausing on the bookshelves filled with science fiction novels, the posters of starships, and the small telescope sitting by the window. Caleb's attempt to look casual faltered as he saw her eyes fixate on the telescope. "I assume you have a fascination with space?" she asked, her voice making the statement sound more like a data point than a question. Caleb chuckled nervously. "Yeah, I guess you could say that. I've always been curious about what's out there. Never thought I'd actually be hosting someone from another planet, though." Niara's lips twitched, a hint of a smile that faded as quickly as it appeared. "I appreciate your willingness to participate in the intergalactic exchange. My mission here is significant." Caleb nodded, not entirely sure what that meant, but eager to make her feel welcome. They spent the first few days settling in, and while Niara was polite and respectful, Caleb could tell she had a purpose beyond just cultural exchange. Her questions were pointed about human habits, social structures, biology, and, increasingly, about human relationships. She seemed fascinated by the idea of love, courtship, and family, concepts that Caleb took for granted, but which Niara approached with a scientific curiosity that made him uncomfortable. One evening, after a particularly intense conversation about the nature of human emotions, Caleb found himself cornered in his own kitchen. Niara stood before him, her eyes gleaming with a mix of intensity and curiosity that he had never seen in anyone, human or alien. She was holding a small, crystalline device that hovered a few inches above her palm, casting a soft glow. "I have been reviewing data on human reproduction and emotional attachment," she said bluntly, her gaze unwavering. "Your species places significant emphasis on these processes, yet your motivations are often illogical and inconsistent. I would like to conduct a direct study." Caleb's stomach dropped. What kind of study?" "A breeding experiment," Niara said, her tone as clinical as a doctor discussing a medical procedure. "To better understand human emotional and reproductive compatibility with Zevian genetics." Caleb stared at her, his mind reeling. "Wait, you mean you want to have kids? With me? For research?" Niara's expression remained unflinching. "Correct. It is an essential part of my mission here. The Zevian High Council has authorized me to engage in a controlled study to explore potential hybridization possibilities with humans." For a moment, Caleb didn't know whether to laugh or run away. "Niara, humans don't. We don't do that kind of thing just for research. It's not that simple." Her brow furrowed slightly, a rare display of confusion. I am aware that your species engages in emotional bonding rituals before reproduction, but from my observations, these are often inconsistent and highly variable. I am willing to engage in such bonding rituals if that is what you require. Caleb's mind raced. He barely knew Niara, and yet she was standing in his kitchen, calmly suggesting they start a family for the sake of science. It's not about rituals, Niara. It's about connection, trust, and feelings. Feelings, she repeated, as if testing the word on her tongue. Yes, I have observed that your species places great importance on such abstract concepts. Very well, Caleb. I am willing to learn about these feelings as part of my study. If you agree to participate, we will begin with an exploration of emotional compatibility. Caleb's brain struggled to catch up. He didn't know what was more unsettling: Niara's calm, clinical approach to something so personal, or the fact that a part of him was actually considering it. She was different from anyone he had ever met, alien in every sense of the word. But there was something about her intense curiosity, her genuine desire to understand, that made him pause. I don't know, he said, his voice shaky. This is a lot to take in. Niara inclined her head. I understand. You require time to process this proposal. I will not pressure you, but I do hope you will consider it. The knowledge we could gain would be invaluable for both our species. She left him standing in the kitchen, the crystalline device still hovering above her hand, as she retreated to her room with a grace that made her seem almost ethereal. Caleb remained there long after she was gone, his mind racing with questions he had no idea how to answer. That night, he lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying their conversation over and over in his mind. He had wanted to learn about the stars, about other civilizations, but this was beyond anything he had ever imagined. Was he really considering it? Could he go through with something so bizarre, so intimate, with someone who viewed him as little more than a research subject? The days that followed were tense, with Niara giving him space while continuing her observations from a distance. She never brought up the proposal again, but her eyes followed him with a quiet intensity that spoke volumes. Caleb found himself unable to shake the feeling that he was standing at the edge of a cliff, about to step into the unknown. Little did he know, the decision he would eventually make would change his life and hers forever. The tension between curiosity, cultural differences, and the complexities of human emotions set the stage for the unfolding drama, as Caleb and Niara navigated the strange and often uncomfortable waters of their unique relationship. The next chapters would delve deeper into the consequences of their decisions, the surprises that awaited them, and the growing bond that would defy both human and alien expectations. Chapter 2. A Scientific Proposal. The atmosphere in the apartment had become almost unbearable. Caleb found himself hyper-aware of every little thing: Niara's curious stares, the way she would silently observe him as he went about his day, and the way she seemed to be waiting for an answer he wasn't ready to give. Days turned into a week, and though Niara never brought up the proposal again, Caleb could feel the unspoken question hanging between them like a heavy cloud. One evening, after dinner, Niara quietly sat down across from him at the small kitchen table. She had a collection of data pads laid out, each one displaying various reports, diagrams, and notes that looked overwhelmingly technical to Caleb's eyes. He knew this was it, the conversation he'd been avoiding. Caleb, she began, her tone measured and calm. I understand that my proposal may have been unexpected. I have taken the past week to review Earth's cultural customs, particularly regarding relationships and emotional bonding. It seems I miscalculated the importance of these factors in human reproductive behavior. Caleb nodded slowly, unsure of what to say. He had spent countless nights thinking about their previous conversation, trying to make sense of his own emotions. On one hand, the idea of participating in a scientific study about human-alien compatibility felt dehumanizing. On the other, there was something oddly compelling about Niara's sincere curiosity, a desire to bridge the vast gap between their species. I'm still not sure I understand, he admitted, feeling vulnerable under her steady gaze. Why me? Why did you choose to make this proposal to me, out of all the humans on Earth? Niara's eyes flickered with something Caleb couldn't quite identify. You are accessible, reasonable, and open-minded. More importantly, you have displayed a willingness to engage with an alien perspective, even when it is uncomfortable or challenging. I chose you because you represent a rare combination of traits that make you ideal for this study. Caleb let out a small, humorless laugh. So, it's not because of any personal feelings? Just that I'm a convenient test subject? Niara hesitated, a tiny crease forming between her eyebrows. I do not fully understand the concept of personal feelings in the way that you do, but I find your presence agreeable. I enjoy our conversations, and I appreciate your patience. If that is what humans refer to as feelings, then I may possess them to some extent. Her admission caught Caleb off guard. He had grown used to Niara's detached, scientific manner, and to hear her speak with even a hint of personal vulnerability was surprising. Niara, if we're going to do this, whatever this is, I need to know that it's not just an experiment for you. I need to know that you're willing to try and understand what it means to be, well, human. Niara's gaze softened, and she nodded. I am willing to learn, Caleb. I want to understand your people, not just for the sake of science, but because I find your culture fascinating and strange in a way that I cannot ignore. That was when she handed him a data pad, a formal document detailing the terms of the partnership. It was surprisingly thorough, outlining everything from boundaries and personal space to medical precautions and emergency protocols. There were clauses for emotional well-being, regular check-ins, and the assurance that either party could terminate the agreement without any repercussions at any time. Caleb's hands trembled slightly as he held the pad. This was real. It wasn't some bizarre dream or hypothetical. He could walk away now, tell Niara that it was too much, too strange, and she would leave him alone. But a part of him, the part that had always yearned to explore the unknown, to push the boundaries of what was possible, wouldn't let him do that. Okay, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. I'll do it. But it's not going to be easy, and we're going to have to go slow. Niara's lips curved into a small, rare smile, and she extended her hand to him, the very human gesture of agreement that she had learned in her time on Earth. Caleb shook it, feeling a strange mixture of anxiety and excitement swirling in his chest. Whatever happened next, there was no turning back. The following weeks were a blur of preparations. Niara set up a small lab space in the apartment, filling it with devices that hummed and glowed with alien technology. Caleb was subjected to a battery of non-invasive test blood samples, genetic analysis, and scans that used wavelengths of light he didn't even know existed. Niara worked with a detached efficiency, though she always took care to explain what she was doing in terms Caleb could understand. In return, Caleb took it upon himself to teach Niara about human culture in a more meaningful way. They watched movies together, everything from romantic comedies to documentaries. They cooked meals, with Caleb introducing her to the diverse flavors of Earth cuisine, while she shared delicacies from Zevia that ranged from the delicious to the downright bizarre. They talked late into the night about philosophy, about what it meant to love, to trust, to desire. Their dynamic began to shift. Niara's scientific curiosity never waned, but Caleb noticed a subtle change in her demeanor. She laughed more easily, though she often tried to stifle it, as if embarrassed by the emotion. She asked questions that were less clinical and more personal about his childhood, his dreams, and his fears. Caleb found himself growing attached, even though he knew that Niara's understanding of attachment was different from his own. The first real test of their new relationship came one night when Caleb was feeling particularly homesick for his family, a feeling he hadn't experienced in a long time. They had grown distant over the years, and his decision to host an alien had only widened the gap. Niara noticed his subdued mood and, without a word, sat down beside him, placing a comforting hand on his shoulder. "What is wrong?" she asked, her voice softer than usual. Caleb hesitated, unsure if he should even bring it up. But he realized that if they were going to make this partnership work, he needed to be honest. "I just miss my family. Things haven't been great between us, and I guess hosting an alien didn't exactly make me the most popular person in their eyes." Niara tilted her head, her gaze filled with curiosity. "Family is important to your people, is it not? Why would they distance themselves from you?" "It's complicated," Caleb replied with a sigh. "Human relationships aren't always logical. Sometimes they get messy, and emotions get in the way." For a long moment, Niara was silent, her eyes thoughtful. Then, to Caleb's surprise, she leaned closer, her cool azure hand still resting on his shoulder. "In Zevian culture, we value rationality above all else. Emotions are seen as obstacles, yet I find myself struggling to understand why your people embrace them despite their complications. Perhaps I am beginning to see why. Caleb's heart skipped a beat at the raw honesty in her voice. For the first time, he realized that Niara was not just an alien scientist conducting an experiment. She was someone who, in her own way, was trying to understand the human experience. And maybe, just maybe, she was starting to feel something that defied the logical parameters of her culture. As the night wore on, they sat together in comfortable silence, the weight of their unspoken agreement settling between them. Caleb's fears hadn't vanished, but they felt lighter, more manageable, with Niara beside him. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, he wasn't afraid to find out. Their journey was only just beginning, with both Caleb and Niara navigating the uncharted territory of human-alien emotions. As their connection deepened, they would face new challenges, test their boundaries, and discover truths about themselves and each other that neither of them could have anticipated. The line between experiment and relationship blurred, and Caleb knew that the hardest and most rewarding part was yet to come. Chapter 3. The experiment begins. The experiment had officially begun. Caleb, still grappling with the reality of what he had agreed to, found himself thrust into a new daily routine. His once mundane apartment now looked more like a hybrid research lab and a cozy home. The sleek, crystalline devices Niara had installed hummed quietly, blending in with the more familiar clutter of human lifebooks, mismatched furniture, and the odd knickknack Caleb had collected over the years. Niara's scientific background became immediately apparent as she approached the project with a meticulousness Caleb had never encountered before. The first few weeks were filled with intense scrutiny, non-invasive scans, medical questionnaires, and long discussions where she probed him for details on human biology, emotions, and cultural practices. Caleb did his best to answer honestly, but it was clear that Niara's understanding of humans was still lacking. "Tell me," she asked one evening, her expression serious, "what is the significance of physical intimacy in human relationships? I understand the biological purpose, but why is it accompanied by such strong emotions?" Caleb paused, caught off guard by the directness of her question. He had been expecting a clinical analysis of their experiment, but Niara's eyes held a different kind of curiosity, one that seemed to go beyond mere data collection. "It's not just about biology," he said slowly, trying to put his feelings into words. "For humans, intimacy it's about connection. It's about feeling close to someone, trusting them. It's not just a physical act, it's an emotional one too." Niara's brow furrowed, her fingers tapping lightly on the edge of the data pad she always carried with her. "Connection," she repeated thoughtfully. "I have noticed that humans form attachments even when it is not strictly necessary for reproductive purposes. Your species places a high value on emotions that my own people consider irrelevant." Caleb nodded, feeling the weight of her words. It was a reminder of just how different they were, how alien Niara's perspective truly was. And yet, he couldn't help but feel a growing bond with her. They were spending almost every waking moment together, sharing meals, watching old movies, and discussing the vast differences between their cultures. It was no longer just about the experiment. They had become friends, though Caleb wasn't sure if Niara understood what that meant. Their first real step towards intimacy came almost by accident. It was a rainy night, and the sound of raindrops tapping against the window filled the apartment with a cozy, almost hypnotic rhythm. They were sitting on the couch, sharing a blanket as they watched a documentary about Earth's oceans, something Niara had chosen, fascinated by the vast, unexplored depths of the planet. She was leaning against him slightly, her cool azure skin brushing against his arm, and Caleb could feel the tension between them building in a way he couldn't ignore. "Caleb," she said suddenly, her voice unusually soft, "I have been analyzing the data from our discussions, and I believe I am beginning to understand the human concept of trust." He turned to look at her, surprised by the emotion in her eyes. "What do you mean?" "Trust," she repeated, her fingers tightening around the edge of the blanket. "It is not logical. It is not based on facts or data. It is a choice, is it not? A decision to believe in someone even when there is no guarantee of certainty." Caleb swallowed, feeling his heartbeat quicken. "Yeah," he said quietly, "that's pretty much it." For a long moment, they sat in silence, the glow of the television casting soft shadows across the room. Then, slowly, Niara shifted closer, her eyes never leaving his. "In that case," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I trust you, Caleb." The words hit him harder than he expected, and before he could stop himself, he leaned in and kissed her, a gentle, tentative gesture that felt both right and terrifying. Niara froze, her eyes widening in shock, and for a split second, Caleb feared he had made a terrible mistake. But then she responded, her movements awkward and unsure, but undeniably sincere. It was a kiss unlike any he had ever experienced, strange, unfamiliar, yet oddly beautiful. When they pulled apart, Niara's expression was one of confusion and curiosity, as if she was trying to decipher the meaning behind what had just happened. "I did not anticipate that," she admitted, her voice trembling slightly. "It was different from what I expected." Caleb chuckled, feeling a rush of relief. "Yeah, it usually is." From that moment on, their dynamic changed. The experiment was no longer a strictly clinical endeavor. It had become something personal, something real. They continued to conduct their research, but the boundaries between science and emotion blurred in ways that neither of them could fully control. Niara's questions became less about data and more about understanding about emotions, desires, and the strange, messy complexities of human relationships. One night, as they sat together in the living room, Niara's gaze grew distant, her eyes reflecting the glow of the city lights outside. "Caleb," she said quietly, "I do not fully understand what I am feeling, but I believe that I am changing." Caleb reached out, taking her hand in his. Her fingers were cool, yet they tightened around his with a newfound warmth. "That's okay," he said softly. "You don't have to understand it right away. Sometimes, it's enough just to feel." Niara's eyes flickered with a hint of vulnerability, and she leaned against him, resting her head on his shoulder. They stayed like that for a long time, wrapped in the quiet comfort of each other's presence, as the rain continued to fall outside. Their experiment had taken on a life of its own, evolving into something that defied both logic and expectation. Caleb knew that they were venturing into uncharted territory where emotions, biology, and cultural differences collided in ways that were both exhilarating and frightening. But he also knew that he didn't want to turn back. Whatever this was, he wanted to see it through, even if it meant facing the unknown. Chapter 4. Beyond the experiment. Their journey together continued, and Caleb found himself growing more and more attached to Niara in ways he hadn't anticipated. He wasn't sure if it was love, how could it be, when she was still so unfamiliar with human emotions. But it was something close, something that made him want to protect her, to be there for her, even when the experiment inevitably ended. As the final phase of the experiment approached, Niara's superiors back on Zevia began to take an interest in her findings. They sent formal communications, requesting detailed reports and updates on the progress of the study. Caleb could sense the pressure weighing on Niara's shoulders, and he worried that the demands of her mission would force her to return to the detached, clinical mindset she had once held. One evening, after a particularly stressful day of data analysis, Niara sat beside Caleb on the couch, her expression unusually somber. "My superiors are expecting results soon," she said, her voice heavy with a weight that hadn't been there before. "They want a full report on the viability of human-Zevian compatibility." Caleb's chest tightened. "And what are you going to tell them?" Niara hesitated, her gaze dropping to the floor. "I do not know. I have learned much about your people, but I am unsure if I can quantify what I have experienced. How do I explain emotions, feelings, and attachments that defy logic?" He reached out, gently lifting her chin until their eyes met. "Maybe you don't have to," he said softly. "Maybe you just have to tell them the truth." She looked at him, her eyes filled with uncertainty and a strange vulnerability that made Caleb's heart ache. "The truth," she echoed. "I am not certain I know what the truth is anymore." The room was silent, the weight of her words hanging between them. Caleb took a deep breath, his own emotions swirling in a chaotic storm. "Niara, the truth is, I care about you. More than I ever expected to. And I don't want this whatever we have to just be an experiment." For a moment, he feared she would retreat, would turn away from him and hide behind the cold logic of her people. But instead, she leaned forward, resting her forehead against his. "Neither do I," she whispered, her voice breaking with an emotion that was unmistakably real. "Neither do I." Their experiment had ended, but their journey was just beginning. For the first time, Niara was no longer a scientist studying an alien species. She was just herself, someone who had found something precious in the chaotic, irrational world of human emotions. And Caleb, who had once longed for the stars, realized that he had found something even more extraordinary right here on Earth. They didn't have all the answers, and maybe they never would. But they were willing to face the unknown together, one step at a time, as they ventured into a future that was as uncertain as it was full of possibility. As they sat together, wrapped in the warmth of each other's presence, Caleb knew that the greatest discoveries were not always about science or logic. Sometimes, they were about the simple act of opening your heart to someone who saw the world in a completely different way and finding, against all odds, that the connection was real. Their story was just beginning, and Caleb knew that whatever lay ahead, they would face it together, hand in hand. Chapter 4. Beyond the Experiment. The final phase of Niara's mission loomed over them like a gathering storm. As Caleb and Niara's relationship deepened, the weight of her obligations to the Zevian High Council became harder to ignore. Niara's initial fascination with human emotions had turned into a genuine struggle to understand and reconcile her scientific duties with the complex, irrational feelings that had begun to take root in her heart. It was no longer just about the experiment, it was about the choice she would soon have to make. Caleb could feel the tension in the apartment. He noticed how Niara's usually calm demeanor would falter whenever she received another communication from Zevia, urging her for more conclusive data. He saw how she would stay up late, her eyes darting between the glowing holographic reports and the few sentimental objects she had started to collect, things that were uniquely human. A photo of them at the local fair, the small houseplant she had insisted on buying despite not understanding its purpose, and a worn-out paperback book Caleb had lent her, which she claimed was illogical but fascinating. One night, after receiving a particularly stern message from the council, Niara sat down with Caleb in the dimly lit kitchen, her face pale and drawn. "They're losing patience," she said, her voice strained. "They don't understand why I haven't provided the results they expected. They want answers, solid, definitive conclusions about human-Zevian compatibility. But I don't have the kind of data they want." Caleb felt a sinking sensation in his chest. He knew this moment was coming, but it didn't make it any easier. "What are you going to do?" he asked gently, his hand reaching out to cover hers. Niara hesitated, her fingers twitching under his touch. "I don't know," she admitted, her voice breaking for the first time. "I don't know how to explain what I've found. I thought I could treat this like any other study, that I could reduce it to numbers and facts. But the truth is, I've changed, Caleb, and I don't know how to make them understand that." He squeezed her hand, his heart aching at the vulnerability in her eyes. "Maybe it's not about making them understand," he said softly. "Maybe it's about being honest with yourself and with them. You've learned more than you ever expected, right? Maybe that's what matters." Niara's gaze dropped, and she stared at their intertwined hands as if seeing them for the first time. "But they won't accept emotions as evidence," she whispered. "They don't value the things I've come to appreciate. If I tell them the truth, I could lose everything." Caleb's stomach twisted, and he forced himself to keep his voice steady. "What if you told them anyway?" he suggested. "What if you showed them what you've learned, even if it's not what they want to hear? You don't have to fit into their expectations, Niara. You're allowed to be more than what they demand of you." She looked up at him, her lavender eyes shining with a mixture of fear and hope. "What if they reject me?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "Then they don't deserve you," Caleb said simply, his voice firm and unwavering. "But I know one thing, they can't take away what you've found here. They can't take away what we've shared." For a long moment, they sat in silence, the weight of the decision hanging heavy in the air. Then, slowly, Niara nodded. "You're right," she said, her voice growing stronger. "I can't pretend that this experience hasn't changed me. I will tell them the truth, whatever the consequences." Over the next few days, Niara worked tirelessly, compiling her final report. But this time, it wasn't just about data or numbers. She wrote about trust, about the messy and unpredictable nature of human relationships, and about the lessons she had learned from Caleb. She described the challenges of understanding emotions that defied logic, the warmth of a shared laugh, and the vulnerability of being truly close to another being. For the first time in her life, Niara allowed herself to be honest not as a scientist, but as someone who had come to care deeply for another. When she finished, she called Caleb over to read the final draft. His eyes scanned the glowing text, and he felt a lump form in his throat. It was raw, sincere, and vulnerable in a way that he had never expected from Niara. He didn't know if her superiors would accept it, but it didn't matter. What mattered was that she had found the courage to be true to herself. The day she sent the report was a quiet one. They sat together in the living room, waiting for the council's response, the tension almost unbearable. Hours passed, and then days, with no word from Zevia. Niara grew more anxious with each passing moment, and Caleb did his best to comfort her, though he could feel the uncertainty gnawing at his own heart. On the fourth day, the transmission finally came. Niara's hands trembled as she activated the holographic message, and Caleb held his breath, his heart pounding in his chest. The stern face of a Zevian counselor appeared, his voice cold and formal as he read the official response. Niara of Zevia, the counselor began. Your report has been received and reviewed by the High Council. We find your conclusions unconventional. The data you have provided does not meet the standard criteria for scientific validation, and your deviation from the original parameters of the study is noted. Caleb's heart sank, and he felt Niara's body tense beside him. He braced himself for the inevitable dismissal, the formal condemnation of her work. But then, the counselor's tone shifted slightly, a hint of curiosity slipping through the cold professionalism. However, the counselor continued, the High Council has determined that your findings, while not scientifically conclusive, possess a unique value. The observations you have made regarding human emotional structures and interpersonal connections have provided insights that cannot be ignored. Therefore, you are granted permission to continue your research on Earth, without the constraints of the original study. Niara's breath hitched, her eyes widening in shock. You mean, I can stay? She whispered, as if afraid to believe it. Yes, the counselor said, his expression softening ever so slightly. Your work will be monitored, and you are expected to submit further reports. But you have demonstrated an understanding of a concept that our society has long dismissed, one that may hold potential value. Proceed with your research at your discretion. The message ended, and for a moment, neither of them moved. Then, as the reality of what had just happened sank in, Niara turned to Caleb, her eyes shining with a mixture of disbelief and joy. I can stay, she repeated, her voice breaking. I can stay. Caleb pulled her into a tight embrace, feeling the tension drain from his body. I told you, he said, his voice thick with emotion. They can't take away what we have. Niara clung to him, her cool hands shaking as she buried her face in his shoulder. They stayed like that for a long time, wrapped in each other's arms, as the weight of their struggle slowly gave way to relief and hope. In the weeks that followed, their lives settled into a new rhythm. The pressure of the experiment had lifted, replaced by the freedom to explore their relationship without the constraints of a formal study. Niara's curiosity remained, but it was no longer the cold, detached curiosity of a scientist. It was the curiosity of someone who had found a place where she belonged, a curiosity tempered by warmth, affection, and a growing understanding of what it meant to be human. They spent their days learning from each other, Niara teaching Caleb about Zevian history and culture, while he showed her the simple joys of human life. Lazy Sunday mornings, spontaneous road trips, and the comfort of a shared meal. They argued, laughed, and sometimes sat in comfortable silence, the understanding between them deepening with every passing moment. One night, as they lay together under the stars on the balcony, Niara turned to Caleb, her lavender eyes reflecting the starlight. I never expected to find this, she said softly. I never thought I would understand why humans value emotions so much, but now I do. Caleb smiled, his hand finding hers in the cool night air. We still have a lot to learn, he said, his voice gentle. But that's okay. We have time. Niara's gaze softened, and she leaned in to press her forehead against his, a gesture she had come to understand as a sign of trust and affection. Yes, she whispered, we have time. As they watched the stars, hand in hand, Caleb knew that their journey was far from over. There would be challenges ahead, cultural differences, expectations from Zevia, and the inevitable misunderstandings that came from blending two worlds. But he also knew that they would face those challenges together, as partners, as friends, and maybe, someday, as something even more. Their story was no longer about an experiment. It was about the simple, beautiful, and unpredictable act of living, of loving, and of finding a place where they both belonged. And for Caleb and Niara, that was more than enough.